Hi, sir.
Let me go.
Well, we may be a somewhat smaller audience tonight because of the Zoom power outage this afternoon. So I'm glad it's back up, and I'm delighted to have everyone here. I'm Barbara Welke. Welcome to Making Connections, New Works in Legal History, which is the virtual book series, I guess you would call it, for new works in legal history. And tonight we're really excited to be having a co-sponsored session, co-sponsored by the ASLH and the Business History Conference. And we have two books that are at that intersection. So the two books and the two authors are Zach Frohlich, From Label to Table, Regulating Food in America in the Information Age, published by the University of California Press in 2023, and Sean Vanatta, whose book is Plastic Capitalism, Banks, Credit Cards, and the End of Financial Control, published by Yale University Press in 2024. We're going to do things a little bit differently since we have two authors together here and two authors and two fields of inquiry that intersect. So the two of them are going to start by talking about that intersection and then individually introduce their books. But I'm going to sign off now. For all of you who have questions as we go along, please post your questions in the chat and we'll get to them later in the hour.
Cool. So thanks, Barbara, for that introduction. Thanks for the platform. Yeah, I mean, Zach and I were just sort of reflecting on the fact that we're both business historians who wanted to do the New Books in Legal History series. And so we thought we'd start by just talking a bit about where we see these intersections between our fields. So that's sort of a question to you, Zach. Like, where do you see business history and legal history kind of overlapping or informing each other?
Yeah, no, I think business historians have gotten interested in legal history in part because in business history you have this challenge of how do you get at archival materials. A lot of the businesses either have closed archives or don't keep archives, and so often in business history you're trying to figure out like how can I get at that information. And a really great way to do this is through a lot of legal sources. So business historians are using lawsuits where the kind of discovery process pulls out and makes public a lot of documents related to business strategy. Or in my own book, I look at administrative dockets. So when the FDA has a new policy, it will invite feedback from the public, and that includes a lot of businesses and other stakeholders. And so those then are in the archives for the FDA, and then it's a way that I can get at that question. So at least one reason why I think business historians are interested in legal history is because they're getting pulled into these kinds of legal sources.
Yeah, I mean, I have the same experience. So, like, as you say, bank archives tend not to be open or available. And so, if you want to understand, in my case, how the credit card industry worked in the 1960s and 1970s, these lawsuits through the discovery process, you really get, bank executives explaining to you what they're trying to do. And so, there's nothing, even in business archives, I think, that will give you that fine-grained detail. I think another kind of key area of overlap, at least in our books, and that I think we would both agree about, is the ways that like law structures markets and the ways that
Absolutely.
motivated business actors try to use either legislation or use the judicial legal process or the administrative process to structure markets to meet their expectations or meet their kind of profit motives, and the ways that other actors, other stakeholders are also using those same systems. And so again, really thinking about both the ways that law creates and is the rules for how markets operate, and then the ways that businesses are innovating within the rules or innovating around the rules, or the ways that those kind of legal structures shape business opportunities.
Yeah, no, when I was looking at your book, one thing the phrase innovating around the rule reminded me of something I've been trying to argue as well, which is that these food companies are designing their foods with the laws in mind. And so it's just an example of how laws are structuring the markets. And I think that's really kind of an important theme in both books that you can see. And I think this is an argument that you're seeing more of the business history as well, where business historians are saying, hey, let's look at these kind of legal contexts for business practice, and see how businesses are shaping them, and vice versa. Another theme that we were talking about that our books have in common is that they're very much political histories. You have this kind of sort of ongoing back and forth among big political institutions. But I see it as being part of what's known as new political history, where you're trying to link these kind of upper level political movements back down to the social movements, and bottom up cultural and social histories. And so in both books, I think there's a lot of that sort of, how is it sort of changes in society are shaping these kinds of policy debates.
Yeah, and the ways that those social movements, in our cases, right, are using either administrative law or, courts or other ways to, again, actively shape the markets through law. And I guess that kind of a last point, at least in terms of thinking about the overlap of these fields. So we have the Hagley Prize, which is the best book in business history. So Anne Fleming and Ed Ballison, both legal historians, have won that recently. There's also, I'm
and
sure,
and Sean's book was a finalist, and my
as
book
was
was a
Zach's.
finalist. We should
So,
sort of wave our flag there.
and then, there's a joint prize, BHC, ASLH prize in honor of Anne Fleming that recognizes the best article in relation to law and business published over the previous 2 years. So there's been a kind of ongoing sort of fertilization or cross-fertilization in these fields, but one I think that promises to continue. And we would certainly invite all legal historians to the Business History Conference, should you wish to come. So I guess with that, we'll kind of go to regular programming. Maybe Zach, if you want to take the 5 minutes, tell us about your book, and then I'll take my turn.
Yeah. Well, this project got started. I'll start with a personal story about that. It got started decades ago, actually. When I was in graduate school, I had a friend visiting me from Europe, and she was, looking at the food packaging in my kitchen and looked sort of at one of the foods. I don't remember which one it was, but then she turned around and she sees the nutrition facts label, and she was sort of looking at it, and she looked at me and smiled and said, "This is so American." Um, and that struck me. I'm really interested in these kind of cross-cultural viewpoints of things, having lived abroad a lot. But what I think she was getting at the time, and this became the kind of, I got curious about what was the story behind this nutrition facts label, is that this was a reflection of American culture in a couple ways. And the two that I focus on in the introduction it was scientistic. Europeans have this idea that, like, what food is good for you. You've known this all along. It's really obvious, but Americans have somehow forgotten this. And so they turn to science to, like, answer this question, like, what do the sort of latest science fads say about what's good food? And then the other is that it's legalistic. I think we're famous for our litigious culture, and the idea that you can slip on a banana peel and they'd have to put a warning label on that. And I think they see this standard black box on the food box, and it kind of evokes this American penchant for kind of legalistic uh, solutions. So one of the things that got me interested in the story was, like, how did this legal and scientific thing get made? But when I investigated the nutrition facts label, I very quickly discovered that that was introduced in the 1990s, but there was a much older story, a much longer story, and it was part of a bigger issue about how did the FDA go about handling uh, market fraud, risk, and a lot of other issues than just nutrition. So the book starts back in the 1930s, with the introduction of food standards, in the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And it looks at that as kind of the earlier system of how the FDA handled these questions. And then it brings that up to a big turning point in the 60s and 70s, where it decides to move away from that kind of system and instead focus on informative labeling. And so the second half of the book is looking at this kind of second approach, first with a voluntary nutrition information label in the 1970s, and then with the nutrition facts label that became required on all foods in the 1990s. And then I kind of look at a variety of other labeling initiatives since the 1980s. And so what I kind of argue is that you have these two different styles of approaching the market that reflect a lot of other concerns about what is the proper role of government in these issues, should consumers be concerned about what they're eating, and what kinds of information do they have a right to have? Um, and how is this of relevance to legal history? I actually came into the legal side of this. One of my mentors in graduate school is Susan Silby, and she's very active in law and society. And her big thing is about legal consciousness. So, how does legality get created in everyday life? And that really framed the question I was interested in, which was, how are the kind of legal understandings of this issue shaping popular understandings of food and responsibility for risk? And then also, in turn, how are popular ideas about that shaping the FDA's concerns, or the lawyers from companies who are making arguments with the FDA about these issues. And I talk about regulation really broadly in the book because I want to make this point that self-regulation is a really common approach to diet, right? I'm thinking about controlling and managing my diet. And so when the FDA makes the move to information labels, in a way, it's unloading onto these consumers this kind of responsibility for regulating, instead of other approaches where you're banning ingredients, or working on the kind of food standard to make sure that food is sort of wholesome and nutritious. And so in the book, there are kind of legal issues I look at. One of the kind of my favorite ones is how the FDA approaches advertising. You have a kind of recognition for a long time that people in marketing make wild claims about food, and this is puffery, and if you say it's the best coffee in the world, no one is going to necessarily say, hey, that's not true, you can't say that. But then there's a certain kind of way of talking about the food where, if you're talking about health, it then brings in the FDA and is concerned about sort of health claims and what are legitimate claims that you can make about that. And the way they frame this is through what's called the consumer expectations test. And so they point out that for certain products like food, you have this kind of ordinary consumer with this sort of expectation of what it is. But then for certain products, especially diet and health products, you have this very credulous consumer. And they argue that this is why we need to be very restrictive about health statements on food. And so this becomes a big concern in the book. And towards the end of the book, you get a kind of backlash to the FDA regulation where, as part of this commercial free speech movement, they're saying, hey, we have a right to make these claims. Consumers aren't sort of hypnotized by them. They can think for themselves. And so this is one of the sort of threads in the story where the kind of legal questions and popular cultural questions kind of meet.
Cool. So yeah, so my book is a history of the credit card industry, effectively. And it begins, as all such stories begin, with me going into credit card debt as a 19-year-old at the University of Georgia. And as I was kind of looking for a dissertation project, I thought about that experience, and I kind of connected that experience to the many American households who, especially through the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, took on high interest credit card debt to the point where, before the 2008 financial crisis, Americans had over $1 trillion in high interest debt. And initially, I kind of imagined framing this as a cultural story. So, what was it about American culture and society in this moment that encouraged people or enabled people to make the choice? But that became somewhat difficult, or too difficult to answer. And what I ended up focusing on is a kind of, how did it become possible? So, a shift from culture to public policy and business strategy. So, how did banks in particular and other firms sort of come into the credit card market? And then how did policy change to accommodate high interest credit card debt that I found and many others found themselves in? So the story, just like Zach's, begins in the 1930s. We both have this sort of framework of the New Deal regulatory state. In my case, it's trying to shape a banking market that will be highly fragmented, that will be regulated both by federal and state law, that will try to make banks sort of safe, stable, and boring. It then sort of picks up the business history aspect. So, how do banks get into the credit card market? In the 1950s, it's focused on helping small retailers compete with department stores. Eventually, the focus becomes much more on targeting affluent consumer households, helping banks that tended to focus on business customers reach the consumer market, which was the booming site, of course, in the American economy in the 1950s and 1960s. The real kind of first pivot of the book comes in the 1960s when banks, which can't build branches across state lines, begin building nationwide networks. So Visa, MasterCard, or what become Visa and MasterCard. And what bankers do when they do this is they figure out, well, the only way we can really build this market is to mass mail credit cards directly to consumers. So banks in the 1960s mail tens of millions of unsolicited credit cards, arguing effectively that they need to be able to do this to build this market, to give consumers access to this new financial product, which will be valuable to them. And this sparks a Polanyian kind of counter movement where consumer groups, labor groups, and other stakeholders respond by, on the one hand, sort of operating at the state level, trying to regulate the prices that banks can charge, but also in Congress, trying to have credit labeling effectively, so truth in lending, telling consumers how much they're paying, limited liability for lost and stolen cards, restrictions on different kinds of credit card marketing. So that while bankers in the 60s thought that credit cards would be a path into consumer markets, a profitable path, by the 1970s, cards are tightly bound within the New Deal regulatory framework and are not obviously a kind of profitable product that the bankers had hoped that they would be. This changes kind of for two main reasons. So first, there's a major legal challenge that focuses on this question of where are credit cards located. So as I said, bankers or consumers had succeeded in using state law to regulate credit card interest rates, but that means there's different rate rules in Nebraska or Iowa or Minnesota. And so this question of like which state ultimately regulates cards as cards are crossing state lines, as banks are issuing cards in neighboring states becomes really important. Eventually, the Supreme Court decides that where the bank is located is what ultimately matters. This is then used by aggressive bankers and especially Citibank, which in its international operations had become very adept at manipulating legal differences across jurisdictions. So, booking transactions to the Cayman Islands, places like that. And they take these skills and they move them back to the US market in the 1970s. They create a sort of nationwide credit card plan by mass mailing pre-approved credit card applications in the 70s. And then they eventually relocate their card business to South Dakota, which has no credit card interest rate controls. And so you move from a kind of legal and regulatory system where states played a really important role in connecting consumers, enabling consumers to control the financial system, what I call a place-based social contract of finance, to a world in which states lose the ability or lose the power to regulate consumer finance, and we essentially end up in a world where banks that charge the highest interest rates can push out banks that don't. States that want to regulate consumer finance can't because their banks will just relocate to states that don't. And so we have a real breakdown in what had been the kind of safe and stable New Deal regulatory structure.
Yeah, and I'll just add a couple things that I really liked reading it. So as a business historian, I have to say, like, you're really talking about bank cards, and it really sunk in when you sort of point out there was this Discover card as a kind of example that there were store cards already existent. Because one thing I know from food, for example, is that, in the early 20th century, you have a lot of people who have like store credit. And it was really common to have this kind of system of store credit, and it was interpersonal. And so part of your story that I think is interesting is like, how do banks take over that kind of relationship to credit through this sort of technology of the credit card? And then the other, I really like the chapter where you do shifting risk, because you talk a lot about fraud. And this is something business historians have gotten interested in. It's a real good place where legal history and business history meet, because, what is a black market, right, is partly about this sort of defining what's legal and not legal. In my own book, I don't have a chapter on it, but I have a lot of this concern about fraud is shaping and driving the questions about sort of food labeling. So anyway, I just really, I'll say one fun thing I would just to sell your book on. I also love the moment in the 1960s when you have this House Postal Subcommittee basically saying, hey, this unsolicited mail with credit cards is a lot like another kind of unsolicited mail of pornography. And I just remember like, actually, I can see that. And so there's a lot of fun moments in the book where, finance history is kind of more entertaining than you would expect.
Well, I think it's also this question about like the fraud question is where like legitimate businesses are trying to, so we have this narrative where businesses want to avoid regulation, but I think in both of our books, what we see is the ways that businesses are actively trying to bring on regulation that will legitimate them, right? And so, the fraud story with banks is like it is also that there's a lot of fraud and they need criminal law to actually prosecute credit card fraudsters. But a lot of it too is this effort, like through this layer of regulation, it creates state legitimacy for businesses that otherwise struggle to have that. And I think in your story too, it's a lot of uh, those regulations give businesses again the kind of state authority or the kind of imprimatur of a good, of healthy food and that kind of thing, which
Well,
is
and
something that they want.
it also is this issue about who is going to bear the cost of those risks. And so this leads into another area that you and I saw a kind of common theme in our books is, how do you go about establishing whether it's the government, it's the businesses, or these consumers who have to bear that responsibility for the risk in these systems?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that then is sort of maybe the first question that I wanted us to both to think about is to come back to like what we talked about at the beginning. So how is law structuring markets in our story? And I think you began to answer that question when you talked about your book, but I wonder if you could maybe spin that out a little bit. So if we say, the role of law is to structure markets, how does that play out in food labeling?
Well, the kind of immediate answer is in the from the 30s to the 60s when the FDA is doing these big hearings on food standards. I mean, the food standards basically look like recipes. I mean, you couldn't cook a food using the recipe, but it has a sort of preset list of ingredients, accepted, techniques you can use, and some kind of range that allows companies to have their own particular sort of, secret recipe. But they're in that sense actually defining, what is food. Um, and then you have a real change in the 70s when they switched to information labeling. A big part of that is to allow companies to start reformulating foods to kind of promote this sort of healthy approach to food. I use that to argue that these two different systems are imagining different kinds of consumers. And not just the two, but sort of there's an evolution in how the FDA understands the consumer as having needs that it's trying to meet. And in the sort of 40s and 50s, it's imagining an ordinary consumer that it's sort of saying we need to protect them from, deceit and scaremongering with health claims. And then starting in the 70s, they shift to this idea of the informed consumer. And this is a person who has their own lifestyle, their own interests. You don't want to tell them what to eat. You want to equip them with this information so they can make those decisions for themselves.
Yeah, I think like what I really liked about your book is that distinction between so how do regulators, how do scientists, how does everyone sort of imagine the consumer? And how do the stakeholders or the policymakers think about how consumers think and imagine how consumers will act to certain kinds of information? And so that then directs certain kinds of regulatory strategies where you're saying, okay, we need to just limit the number of foods in the marketplace because that's just confusing to the ordinary consumer. So if we just
Yeah.
say this is what peanut butter is, and there can't be lots of peanut butters, there's just going to be one.
Yeah.
That effort at simplification, as you show, imagines a certain kind of consumer, and then there's this transformation in the 70s where the imagined consumer changes. And I think like there's a couple ways that that manifests in my book, and I wish I'd had that language to explain this shift. One is the distinction actually between the way the law treats criminal fraud and kind of like truth in lending and informed consumers. So,
Yeah.
the in criminal fraud, like the criminals have to you have to be able to demonstrate that they understand how the credit card system works enough to commit fraud in particular ways, to deceive the merchant, knowing that they're going to ultimately harm the card issuer. And if they don't actually understand this relationship between merchants and card issuers, then it's not fraud. Um, But at the same time, consumers are meant to understand that even if they use their credit card with a particular merchant in Iowa, they should know that the bank located in Nebraska is where interest will be charged. And so it assumes that consumers have this understanding of the network infrastructure that shapes credit card markets. But the law doesn't assume that criminals have that. That actually has to be demonstrated.
Yeah.
And then it is also the kind of key shift, or there's a kind of key argument in the 60s where some policymakers are saying, well, all we need to do is tell consumers the price of credit and they'll make their own choices. This is Paul Douglas in particular, and he's talking about it as credit labeling. But that argument sort of loses initially to consumer advocates to say, no, we need to restrict the price. We need to say you cannot charge more than 18%. That we don't want to create a broad market where all informed consumers can make whatever choice they want about credit. We actually want to narrow the market and give sort of low cost, safe credit to some consumers while keeping others out because, we don't trust them to make adequate and informed decisions, or we're trying to protect them from themselves, or, a variety of other explanations.
Yeah. One of the reasons why I get interested in this idea of how these people are imagining consumers is because I see my book as like looking at this weird world of administrative law. And with the FDA, it's like you have a variety of different experts there. You have their science-based, evidence-based regulations, so they're bringing in scientists. You have lawyers who have very legalistic ways of thinking, and then you have sort of advertisers and marketers with their own ideas of who the consumer is. But it's very much this expert institution. And one thing about administrative law that's really kind of a challenge is that it is experts in a democracy, right? And so the question about the relationship of these experts to the public, at what points are they sort of deferring to the public interest, and at what points are they saying, no, this is the kind of correct technocratic way of doing that? And I see this as something that also both of our books are kind of addressing and dealing with.
Yeah, well, it's kind of the shift, at least in something that we talked about before, and I think you specifically articulated in your introduction, which is from kind of the New Deal to the neoliberal state. And so this shift from experts defining, the boundaries of risk to essentially saying, well, we're going to inform consumers and let the consumers make their own choices about the risks that they'll take on or not take on. But that's not a shift that necessarily comes with fewer rules or fewer regulations or less
Mm.
government. It's just a different way of imagining the who the risk-bearing sort of party is and how they're meant to act within the market.
Yeah, I personally, when I pick my projects, like to think about like what is an everyday object that you kind of take for granted, this mundane thing, and then can we show a kind of backstage of lots of different experts and like ask the question like how are they shaping that everyday understanding? And just as a pitch to what I like about Sean's book, one of the last chapters, he has this opening line where he says, "When you bought this book, you likely used a bank card," and I just love that because it's this moment where you just start realizing this is an everyday object. Like everybody uses this. My daughter, when she was 3, um, thought credit cards were money, and she didn't know what cash and coins were. Like that, what were those for? Because she would see me use this card all the time. And so this kind of way in which Sean's book shows us how this plastic tool came into being, and now we just take it for granted. But and as the book evolves, you see these things that you're like when it became plastic was a kind of great moment. How that happens, I think, is what really makes the book kind of interesting read.
Well, that's very cool.
Yeah.
This conversation has just been fantastic, and we have a long list of questions. And we'll invite everyone to turn their screens back on if they're able, and we'll I will hopefully become a small person too. There you go. And we're going to dig into the questions. So I'll invite individuals to ask their questions, and if you're not stirring eggplant, or reading a food label, or buying something online, doing your online shopping during the event, you'll ask your question. If not, I'll ask it. So Dirk, why don't you get us started?
Can you hear me now?
Yep,
Okay. Okay. Well, this is great. This is fascinating. So I had two questions. And can I ask them both or
you
Barbara?
may. You
Okay.
you dig in.
Okay. I mean, one is really from where you all started. Um, I'm old enough to know that when I began, legal history was business history or history of commerce, and then sometime, probably around the time Barbara entered into legal history, but sometime in the early 80s, that began to change. And then basically business disappeared from legal history for the next generation. And then Sean came to do graduate school at Princeton, and suddenly business history was back. So I would be curious what led to the return of business history, and and also a kind of more historiographic one question. Is the new business legal history much connected to the old business legal history? So that's my first question. The second one is really about federalism. And shall I wait with that, Barbara, or shall I just go ahead?
Why don't you go ahead and throw it out there?
Okay, just, both books, but particularly Sean's, are all about federalism and state constitutional law. Um, and I guess I'm just, we live in a crisis of constitutional law in which federalism is central. And I'm just curious how you all intersect with the contemporary crisis, with the presentism of your story, um, which, anyway, I'll stop at that point.
Should,
Do you want to start,
should I
Zach? Yeah,
tackle
go
one,
ahead.
you tackle two, and then we'll just kind of build on each other?
Sure.
Sure.
Yeah.
I, so I am not going to give the definitive answer. I'm going to give one answer to this question about legal history and business history. Um, so I, my interpretation is that business history is always has a part of it that's very interested in sort of firms and firm strategy and what is the firm doing. And I think there was a moment where the kind of cynical assumption was that laws were about capture, like you either had captured the government or not. And therefore it was like, have you secured a monopoly on the market or not through the law? I think the 2008 financial crisis absolutely wrecked a lot of those thoughts. Also really exposed what we're already a growing critical viewpoint about neoliberalism, right? Market-based reform. And so I think that was at least a moment where more and more people were interested in hearing, okay, wait, there's something more complicated going on between businesses and law. It's not just simple capture. And also this neoliberal project can fail miserably. I mean, I don't think that was a surprise to some people, but it was like became evident. And I think that then led people to sort of build on this, like, what is neoliberalism really? And, how is it sort of embedding a lot of ideas about what is the market, what is the government place of government. So I would sort of say, one simple answer to that question would be that.
And I might, like, as I was thinking about your answer, Zach, we had this kind of suite of like business, like business lobbying and business politics books. So Ben Waterhouse, Kim Phillips Fine, the kind of like, neoliberal intellectual tradition as it then infects business and then infects policy. But I still think that those are the kind of books where you end up with like the rule change, and then you don't see the kind of life of the rule change as it's dealt with by the court system. Um, and so I think the next wave of kind of business legal scholarship has been more interested in actually like how the regulatory policies work. Or, like in Zach's case, like how they're made and then how they work in practice and how these relationships and networks between regulatory institutions and business actors continue to evolve over time. Like, I don't know. I didn't look at your footnotes, Zach. I doubt you cite Willard Hurst. I'm not sure that I do either.
No.
I do in my next book, though, Dirk. So wait for it. So yeah, I think, like Chuck McCurdy, I think is like in my notes somewhere, but that's because I'm your student, Dirk. So I don't know. I don't think that I think there is kind of a break in the same way that we have this new political history that isn't as clearly connected to the old kind of consensus political history. It's trying
Yeah.
to build on that, but do something new it's a kind of post neoliberal creation. And then the federalism story, I don't know, Dirk, I kind of want to know what you think about this. On the like you could like if like during the Biden administration, you might say, man, federalism, all the Republican states that are trying to destroy Biden's policies, this is the worst thing that ever existed. And now you think, come on, California, like sue, sue, sue. And so it's tense, right? You don't want full federal preemption. I think you still maybe want powerful subnational governments that can innovate policy. The challenge, right, is that, like as in my story, where those policy innovations can become national by default. And so that I think is something that, in the same way that like California can often set national market standards by saying we're going to limit, we're going to tell you how a mattress has to be made, and then that's going to structure, the entire mattress industry. There are ways that there's like kind of state level market power and other kind of state level legal routes through which federalism becomes national. And I think that's
Yeah,
really tricky. Yeah, go ahead, Zach.
I want to say, like, so a strength of Sean's book is this federalism and the role of the state, and a weakness in my book is I don't do enough with the kind of state level versus federal. The one exception suggests that in every topic you may have a different opinion about it. So one thing is how federalism works for credit cards, and another thing is how it works for food. Um, in the last chapter, I look at several different labeling initiatives, and one of them is California's Proposition 65. And if you live in California, you know what I'm talking about because you see labels everywhere, because it's an anti-carcinogen law. Um, and in the 80s, when this was bubbling up and leading into 1990, industry was terrified that you're going to have these like carcinogenic labels on all the food and that people were going to get really freaked out about this. And one of the reasons that they eventually backed the 1990 Nutrition Labeling and Education Act, which led to the nutrition facts label, is because they were trying to preempt the state law. It didn't end up happening, but that was the kind of motivation. So with food, a lot of industry hates patchwork rules. They absolutely hate it. And I have to say, what's so interesting about the moment we're living in is that the kind of rolling back of a lot of federal laws, at least enforcement, is pushing it back to the state, in a way that I think the food industry is, I don't want to say terrified, but like I'm on email listservs for the food industry, and they are absolutely unhappy with Make America Healthy Again. And especially this sort of strategy of send it back to the states. Let's get West Virginia or the administration isn't saying, look at California's ban on chemicals, but like West Virginia, right? This is great. And so it's a kind of, depending on the subject, it can create different kinds of coalitions about what is good or bad about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think like you see the opposite in finance where firms are in the Wyoming legislature trying to get particular crypto regulations on the books. And there's, in finance, there's a kind of transnational dimension too. So like the Basel III rules that have been so successfully resisted by US financial firms. So trying to limit international uniformity so that you've got the US as a standalone case and then states within the US that are going their own way. So in finance, fragmentation is preferred, I think.
Fascinating. I'm going to jump in here with the next question. Siobhan, do you want to ask your first question?
Sure. So you guys are both working at the intersection of law and business history, or at least tried to do this talk at the intersection of law and business history. And do you see any methodological blind spots in legal or business history in their current configurations as fields? And how are your works trying to bridge or challenge those tendencies?
Do you want me to start on that, or you want to
Yeah,
start?
please.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just say this. I actually got training in science and technology studies, and that is a field that, if you visit their conferences, feels like it owns the concept of expertise. But I was interested in regulatory science, and legal institutions sometimes don't care about the science. They care about other things. And that got me thinking about, like, there are many types of experts. And then Business History Conference adopted me. And so I got interested in market experts. And I got interested in, like, how do all these different experts see the same topic? And I think one of the easy blind spots that's really hard to navigate, I don't have an answer methodologically to say like this is how you do it, but is that I think a lot of legal historians simplify the business story. Like outside of business history, when people talk about businesses, they tend to talk about business industry in a way that at the business history conference we would just kind of like say that's doesn't make sense because it's very heterogeneous and they have different strategies. And I think the opposite happens in business history where they don't think about state versus federal, they don't think about litigation versus administrative law versus policy. Like, so I just want to say, like, I think part of it is just simply how do you kind of learn both fields and then integrate them is a real challenge.
Yeah, and I guess like my plug maybe for business history as it currently stands is that you have this right like Chandlerian tradition, and there are kind of like old school business historians who still like stock the business history conference. But I think I don't know, my interpretation of the new history of capitalism is essentially like methodological plurality. Like you just take the things that you think are going to be useful to understand your story. And so, my experience was I never thought that I would be a legal historian, but it just was so obvious that I had to understand how the law operated and how these different actors were using law to shape these markets that I just had to become one by default. And I think that the kind of breadth of the new history of capitalism means that you can take in different methodologies without being, outside the field all of a sudden. So you can be a business historian and a legal historian and a political historian and a gender historian all at the same time. And that is, encouraged, historian of science all at the same time. Um, so I think that there's maybe an openness, at least at the Business History Conference, through that sort of vector of the new history of capitalism that I think is new and is good for the field.
Well, I was thinking of jumping to another methodological question, but Sean, your reference to gender is a perfect segue to Mitra's question. So, Mitra, jump in.
Yeah, thanks. So, two questions, I think, for both of you. First one is, what is the role of women and gender in your story? Sean, I was thinking of like pre-1974, women couldn't have credit cards, right, without their husband's permission. But that's the first question. Second question, I thought was more for Zach, but Sean, it sounds like you also write about fraud. And so the question is, where do your books fit into the larger scholarship on, I think of it as false studies, like the history of scammers and con artists and fraudsters? Have you thought about your work in the context of that kind of literature? And if so, what is it adding?
So, I mean, I'm happy to start. So first of all, like one kind of key is the way, and this goes to something that we had talked about earlier, is the way that bankers are imagining their target market. So they very much understand when they're thinking about entering the credit card market and as they continue to develop it over time, there's a kind of gendered segmentation in which there's kind of like female driven household shopping. And so bank cards really fall into that. These are cards that are being taken by small merchants like clothing retailers. And so bankers are really trying to think about how do we create a product that Mrs. Housewife, and they use that language, is going to use, as opposed to there's this alternative credit scheme that's check credit where you write a check. And this is what we have in the UK, or had when we had checks. And they imagine that, bankers imagine that as very male, like it's the head of household who writes the checks. And so you don't want a credit system built around checks because you don't want the husband to have to go around and like sign his name all the time. So credit cards, very female focused. And then, you can contrast that with things like American Express and Diners Club, which are credit cards for male traveling business executives. And so the important moment comes when you get the nationwide bank card networks where there's an effort to combine these markets, to say the bank credit card can be both the family card and the travel and entertainment card. And we need to do that because otherwise it's not going to be a viable um, system. And then in terms of, well, maybe I'll stop there and I'll come back to fraud. But Zach, do you want to jump in on gender?
I'll just say, I mean, gender is significant in my book in the sense that the reason why I talk about imagining consumers uh, is because people talk a lot about what consumers want, and often they're just projecting themselves into the story. And so I wanted to be very agnostic about that. And what I was interested in is who's showing up to the political debates. And in the first half of the book, you have very active homemakers associations, different kinds of women's group who are sort of lobbying in the public interest. That sort of ends in the 1970s, and feminist historians have talk a lot about what happens in the 1970s that makes being a housewife not a kind of credible political identity for the left. Um, and instead, you start getting the kind of public interest groups are much more biomedical. They're like Center for Science in the Public Interest, appealing to health. And so that is a shift in both who is sort of being the spokesperson for the consumer, and also a shift in sort of how policymakers are thinking about the gender of the consumer. Um, can I do this? Can I answer the false studies question and then let you kind of jump in that? So I absolutely love this question. The way I see it, in science studies, there's this great current area of interest called agnotology, which is the production of uh, doubt and the production of ignorance. And what they're basically doing is saying, hey, science is about the production of knowledge. We have all these stuff to study how scientists produce knowledge. Actually, there is a whole sub-industry, and it's starting with tobacco, but you can see it with asbestos and climate change, of that basically is trying to produce doubt and ignorance about scientific knowledge. Um, and in my book, I look at this, like there are moments where the food industry sees that a new health claim is going to tank their products. And so I'm interested, how do they lobby scientists, and how do they lobby the public to try to discredit this new kind of scientific knowledge and produce doubt about it? And it's like, so that's one sort of answer to the false studies. Also, broadly speaking, the book is very much a story of how does the FDA try to centralize information and credential information as reliable. And it is doing this in a context where people are continuously doing the opposite. They are providing alternative information. Our current Health and Human Services secretary is part of a long tradition of alternative ways of understanding vitamins that the FDA was at a kind, and the American Medical Association was at a kind of 100-year-long war against. They called it nutrition quackery. And so you have to understand the food labeling story as how do we centralize and standardize information given this kind of plural, complicated world. And some of it is sort of deliberately disinformation, some of it is just misinformation, and some of it we don't think it's credible. But in the 1980s, you start to get a lot of interest in kind of alternative medicine movements. And so they don't want to say this is lying, but they also don't want it creating confusion about what is a food product versus what is a biomedical drug and a kind of health claim. So there's this kind of information environment, and the book is very much interested in that question.
Yeah, so I don't know very much about the false studies literature, but I have this fraud chapter and it was one of my favorite to write because I am trying to understand how did fraudsters come to figure out how credit card systems worked and how did they develop schemes to maximize profits? And I very much try to frame them as essentially as business innovators, right? That as legitimate credit card networks are built by banks, illegitimate fraud networks come into being that are like stealing cards in Los Angeles and then using them in New York because they know that it's going to be really tricky to prosecute them across state lines. And so you see the development of different fraudulent schemes to take advantage of the innovative business practices that make nationwide credit networks possible.
Fantastic. Thank you. All right, so we've still got a bunch of questions to go. We've only got 5 minutes, and we started a couple minutes late because of the whole Zoom thing. So we might just extend just a couple minutes, even though that totally violates our ethos. But John, why don't you jump in here?
Thank you, and great conversation, both of you, and thanks to the organizers too. I hope this is not a misframed question, but it strikes me that regulation is very national and subnational in scale, but business is not. And that's even true of the food business, which is probably less transnational than some, but it's not entirely as local as the regulatory environment. So how does internationalism and the fact that trade allows food to cross borders and businesses operate in multiple countries and all that sort of thing, and that's probably increasingly true as your story goes on. Is there an international dimension to the business side, but also potentially to the regulatory side? Are there discussions among regulators across borders about standardizing or not or whatever? And I think that the same question might apply in some ways to the financial sector as well, in a way that I'm unfamiliar with. But Sean mentioned it briefly, so I'd like you to talk about that.
So I'm happy to jump in just to be brief. So two ways. One is that because of the kind of different international jurisdictions, at least in my story, bankers learn to engage in different businesses abroad that they can't engage in at home. And so they're very much trying to kind of repatriate that experience and innovate around local rules using their sort of international experience. The flip side is what I see is U.S. credit card regulations often get exported. So truth in lending, for example, moves from the US to the UK as they're adopting US style credit cards. So there's this kind of idea in other places that, well, we've imported this US financial product, maybe we should import their regulatory structure as well. Things get changed, right, in different local markets, but there is a kind of moving in and moving out in both directions in finance.
Yeah, I don't do as much of the international context in the book as I should, but you're absolutely right. These businesses are thinking about international markets. With food standards, that's actually very much an active concern. And in fact, one of the interesting things about standards, usually standards aren't set by governments. They're often set by industry, and it's a way that industry promotes a kind of a non-governmental regulation, is that they'll kind of get together and set standards. And at the international level, that's especially true. And then countries will just adopt those international standards. And so you can see this happening in the United States. It happens with the US Department of Agriculture with voluntary standards. And then in the post-war, they go abroad and they kind of are lobbying in Europe and then later in Asia to set those standards in a way that harmonizes what is increasingly a global market. For information labeling, it's much more national in how the concerns get expressed. I'll say the US, for much of the story I'm telling, is a leader for nutrition labeling. And as the US starts to adopt nutrition labeling, a lot of countries abroad, because they're getting flooded with US products, manufactured products, also then start to explore nutrition labeling, but they lag behind. But you have the story of genetically modified foods where you can absolutely see that intersection. And I talk about it in the last chapter because that was actually an early interest of mine in food. Was I was living in Europe as an undergrad, and they just had a completely different relationship to genetically modified foods than we did. And so there you can see, in Europe, there's this, it's framed as a pro-consumer push that at least we're going to label it so that consumers know what they're getting. While in the United States, even while it's pushing the nutrition label and saying, hey, we're pro-consumer, in the 1990s, it's saying, we're not going to allow GM labeling because it's substantially equivalent and this will just confuse people. So you do see, and then the GM labeling issue becomes one of these sort of disputes about, is this a kind of fair market protectionism or is it, inappropriate, and kind of companies have their own position on that.
Super interesting. Pam, I'd like to invite you in.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Barbara. Thank you for organizing this. And thanks for a great conversation. It's nice to see my business history friends here. And so one thing, just quickly, it's not my question, but in response to the breadth of business history, so I've been involved in this for 40 years, and it has definitely changed, and gender and culture and other cultural factors, class and so on, were involved. And I think actually calling it the history of capitalism came after that, as trying to give a new umbrella term. And that's a whole other discussion. But anyway, my official question, is about trade journals, because I've always found them extremely useful sources, because that's where people in different businesses go to talk to each other, learn from each other, express their problems, and so on and so forth. So I wondered if either of you use those. And I mention that because you started off talking about going into legal literature to address your questions.
So yes, my first research paper as a graduate student at Georgia was on female bank teller uniforms, and I did the entire thing with, banking trade journals, trying to show that like women's uniforms were really like male bank tellers were just in suits. They were like uniform as a suit, but female bank tellers looked like flight attendants, and so it was clear like who was going to get promoted and who wasn't. Um, but yeah, I think the challenge with the trade literature I found is that you still have to really think carefully about who's writing in it and what their motivations are. Um, and you often have, at least in my case, a lot of consultants who are trying to sell certain versions of the credit card system and sell their services to banks. And so like it's definitely something that I used extensively, but I felt a bit like it wasn't as clear that it was the kind of unvarnished, here's what we're doing. It was still financial experts or, bankers trying to sell a vision of what the future should be to their colleagues. And that's interesting. But it wasn't always as like, but here's what they're actually doing.
Well, yes, and that's part of the magic of using them.
Well, the opportunity there is I like business to business advertisements in trade journals a lot, because while they're clearly selling something to the other business, in the meantime, they're making all kinds of really honest statements about the consumer. Some of the ones that first gave me a synthesis are the efforts by Abbott Laboratories to sell its new artificial sweetener sucralose. And in the images, like they're talking about, they're talking about she may not actually need a diet this drug is a diabetic drug, and showing this fat woman, and she's like, but she might want it anyway, even if it's not a health concern. And when they're doing this at a moment when the FDA is saying you can't advertise these drugs to dieters, this is a health product. And so they're very honest about who they imagine the consumer is. I will say that trade journals, as a pitch to legal historians, are places where you will see them covering the regulatory news and pending regulatory news, and then speaking very frankly about what they think about it. So it could be, if that you're looking at a regulation related to industry, going into the industry trade journals and seeing what they're saying can be very useful. They'll do bullet by bullet explanation of how it's going to affect the industry and why it's undesirable in a way that does the work for you.
Well, thanks so much. I actually, Pam, spent a huge amount of time working in trade journals for my first book, and railroad and streetcar related claims agents, all of those trade journals. And beginning work on my second book, I was bemoaning the fact that the Coca-Cola bottler was only owned by one place. And my husband said to me, "Are you listening to yourself? You're shocked by this?" Anyway, well, this has been just a fantastic conversation. All my questions are going to unfortunately have to wait for some kind of private conversation with Sean and Zach. Thank you all so much for being here. I want to say just two things in closing. This is our last um, event for the year. I'm so glad Dirk is here because he started us off this fall with his new book, Nobody's Pal, if I got the title right there. I want to thank Siobhan Barco. In the fall, Emily Preifogel did all tech work for us, and that was fantastic. So thank you to Emily. And Siobhan took over in January, and has seen us through the spring. And as we know, we wouldn't be here without that. So thank you, Siobhan. Keep your eyes open for the announcement of the call for next year. We're waiting till after decisions are made by the program committee about the program, but the announcement will come out shortly, but the deadline won't be until later in the summer. So keep your eyes open. We'll see you back here in September, and and wishing everyone a good end of term. So thank you all. And thank you for this amazing, just amazing books that I can't wait to read. So
Thank you.
good night, all.
Thank you so much.